And all, I think all being well, we are live. Welcome to the Dalriada Tea with the Trustee webinar. I'm just going to give a couple of seconds for people to join in because I appreciate clicking on links can take a moment. But as it's a punchy 30 minutes, we'll kick off pretty much straight away. Just in terms of opening remarks, clearly, thank you very much for joining. It's greatly appreciated. There's a lot of webinars at the moment, and thank you for choosing ours. We're going to spend the next half an hour covering the 3 high-level questions that were in the invite, giving insight from Vassos and myself as to our experience of working with advisors. We will then go to a Q&A, taking on the questions that have been raised for those who've registered for the webinar. And if questions come throughout, there is a Q&A box on your link. Then we will try and answer any questions that come through the webinar as well, if time permits. And that's the general running order. We'll stick to time and hopefully you find it valuable. So very briefly, I'm Chris Roberts. I'm board director of Dalriada. I'm a professional trustee accredited by the APPT, and I work on a number of trustee appointments ranging from a very small amount of assets to several hundreds of millions. And I'm a pensions management specialist by background, so experience in working in-house and in consultancy. I'll let Vassos introduce himself.
Thank you, Chris. Yes, I'm Vassos Vassou. I am an actuary by background. I qualified as an actuary over 20 years ago, and that's where I have spent most of my career before joining Dalriada Trustees in 2016. I too work as a professional trustee like Chris, and I work on a range of schemes. Some of my appointments are in a sort of non-executive or chair role, and other appointments in a sort of working as part of a sole trustee team. In my experience, I get to work, I'm pretty lucky, I get to work with lots of different advisors and different consultants, and therefore get to hear what everybody's saying out in the marketplace. I'm also accredited by the Association of Professional Pension Trustees like Chris, and I actually sit on council with them. So that's the introductions. What we're going to do now, as Chris says, is dive into those main 3 questions that we raised. And the first one was what it feels like to us as trustees to receive advice from all the advisors out there from different firms, and sometimes from different people within the same firm. And to talk a little bit about this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just give you an example of what it was like for me going through the recent advice that we've been receiving around GMP equalisation, which is a topic that's come to the fore over the last 12 months or so. And in our role as professional trustee, we've been able to see what all the different firms are saying about GMP equalisation, the steps that we should be taking with our different schemes, and the approaches that we should be taking going forwards as well. And what that has meant for us as professional trustees is that we're in a position where we can quite quickly sort of develop our own knowledge around GMP equalisation, because we're getting to see all of the different technical arguments that are being made. Plus, we're also able to compare what the different firms and different advisors are saying as well. And that's knowledge that we then take with us from one appointment to the next and so on. So when we engage in these conversations, we're in a position where we can actually challenge the advisors in terms of what they're saying. Now, that's just an example around GMP equalisation. It actually applies as well to all sorts of other areas of running a pension scheme, that particular principle of hearing what all the different firms are saying. And it might be in relation to, say, covenant or investment aspects and so on. So, and that's an important little theme that I think is going to run through some of these questions and so on that we're going to be talking to as we go through this webinar. So that was my sort of brief summary of what it feels like. I guess the extra point I would make is that what I have seen sometimes is where I've received advice on particular topics from the same firm, but perhaps different advisors on a particular appointment. You can see sometimes how the different advisors approach that particular topic, sometimes in a more or less enthusiastic way, depending on the circumstances. So, and in my role, I can sometimes see that and feel that in terms of what the advisors are saying. So those are my thoughts. I don't know if Chris, you had anything else to add on that.
Yeah, probably just a general comment. I think there's a real mix in the advisory market, and there are some firms where you can tell very clearly they have a house view, and they will apply that view across their portfolio. Where some firms give far more flexibility to the case team in order to try and find a solution that fits the case rather than what the hard firm view is. Trusteeship and pension schemes are not. It's not a one size fits all solution. So I feel it's a lot better to work where the actuary, the investment consultant, has an air of flexibility to try and find that square peg and square hole rather than the square peg and round hole. So I think that how that interacts and the framework underpinning the advisor, I think, is crucial to make sure that the good consultants are able to put their best foot forward and bring their best for us, their clients. So that would probably be the expansion of the points Vassos has well made. Without going to me to you and questioning, I'm going to take question 2. So this is covering how people should pitch advice when there's a professional trustee on the board. Now, this is an interesting one because ultimately, whether we're on the board or not, it doesn't really matter. It's the rest of the trustee board, unless it's a sole case, obviously, who are as important as the professional trustees. So you shouldn't be presenting a paper to pander to one trustee over another. The paper should be clear, it should be understandable, the advice should be concise, and the summary and conclusion should be clear and ideally at the front, so we don't have to wait 25 pages before we get there. So my take on this is you should always pitch the advice paper to the board. And again, trying to avoid that one size fits all. Some trustee boards may have a large amount of pensions experience, even out with the professional trustees, and they may not need a training deck of 20, 25 pages for a specific topic. Whereas some boards really might need that granular build-up as they're new to pensions and really need that support. So tailoring the solution not just to the professional trustee on board, but to the whole board. And any board needs to move at the pace of its slowest member. Otherwise, it's not making appropriate decisions. And obviously, we have that point of being joint and severally liable. If they don't understand what's going on, that is a problem for me. I've failed as a professional trustee, and the advisors have failed in their job of bringing that across to the whole group. So that would be my take on it.
Just to add to that as well, Chris, I mean, there is a case where it's a sole trustee type appointment, and there I think it is potentially slightly different, where you're working, where as an advisor, perhaps you're working directly with a professional trustee or a group of professional trustees. And then I think the standard approach that some advisors take might need to be a little bit more tailored, to even more than normal, to reflect the fact that the professional is probably a bit, as I was saying earlier, a little bit more up to speed with some of the particularly the more technical aspects of running a pension scheme, and therefore much more interested perhaps in getting to the answer straight away, and a bit like you were saying, but probably even more so. And I would also say that sometimes I've seen sole trustee appointments where they are working with small pension schemes, and what the advisory firms are doing is they're tending to put their sort of more junior staff, the less experienced staff, on those small appointments, perhaps to use them as sort of a training ground or whatever, to help their own staff get some experience. But then they're throwing those staff into an environment where there's a professional sole trustee involved, and potentially exposing them a little bit more than they need to. So I think my challenge in that particular example would be to the advisory firms to think hard about the teams that they put forward, particularly where it's a sole trustee appointment, to make sure that works as smoothly as possible. So moving on, just conscious here of time, it's going past quickly. The next question that we had was around tender exercises, and really the point here was that wanting to sort of a little bit demystify what it's like from running a tender exercise for us as trustees, so that make it a little bit more open for all the advisors to understand what it is that we're doing and how we do it. I guess we're running a tender exercise. One thing as a firm of professional trustees is that we get to do this quite a lot. I have to say that from a personal perspective, it's not actually one of the bits of the role that I enjoy the most. And the reason being that I find myself, feeling a little bit for the people that are tendering for the work. I know it's a big project and so on, but there can only be one winner. And I find, speaking to those that have, often done very well and presented very well, but just haven't quite made it over the line, I find that bit quite hard. I think what I would say is that when we run exercises, it's because the appointment is there to be won by the best and most suitable firm for that particular appointment. It's not something I wouldn't advocate sort of running tender exercises for the sake of running them or doing them as some sort of cost management exercise. That's not the purpose of the role. And I wouldn't, in my experience as well, I find that if you're the incumbent, I would hope that actually, you've been doing a good job and so on, and therefore actually you're in a good position to win the exercise as well. And I would hope that your experience and knowledge will put you in a good position. From our perspective as a professional trustee, especially on a new appointment, the last thing we want to do is lose all that history and knowledge that exists. And so we're always a little bit sensitive to that particular point. I don't know if anything else you want to add, Chris.
Yeah, I think my key points are just on stakeholder management. Ultimately, people put a huge amount of time into preparing and presenting to win work. And I believe you need to be transparent, make sure everyone understands the process, run it in a time that allows you to get a decision made and a decision made properly. Keep everyone involved in the process as up to speed as you can throughout the process, so that they're not, you don't hear for 8 weeks, you think you've lost. That's not really the way you should be working. And when giving feedback, give constructive feedback. Telling everyone they lost on fees or they were a narrow second is not really going to help them win the next one. You need to be direct and constructive on the feedback. Otherwise, you're just going to end up telling them they've lost every single time, because they're not learning from what didn't work. And I would also say, if you're running an exercise, long lists can't be too long. It's not credible to try and run 8, 9, 10 firms against one another for a mid-tier full service appointment. You're just going to create a process that's really hard to manage, really hard to differentiate, and waste a huge amount of time. A short list should be a short list, 3 to 5 people who you definitely know can do the job, depending on the size that's there, and that will avoid a lot of people spending avoiding a lot of unnecessary time. So these are the areas that I really think are important. And finally, a trustee board should take a step back and decide if it has the skills to run a tender process. There is third-party procurement providers out there in the market, and they're there for a reason. If you're doing a particularly big tender, you need to take a step back and decide, as you as a board have the ability and skill set to run that tender properly. Otherwise, you might be at risk of making the wrong decision. So that's quite an important first step before you kick off.
Okay, I'm going to run through the questions that we had submitted prior to the event this afternoon. So the first one we've got, can the panel share an experience when they received particularly good advice from advisors and why it was good?
Okay, I'll take that one, Susan. I think as a professional trustee, much of the role that we actually perform is that of the person that brings the different parties together and actually finds solutions that works for all of the different stakeholders. And so if I give you an example of what I mean, I'm a chair of a trustee board, and I know that we were going through evaluation process, and we've gone through the whole sort of process as you would normally do. And the trick was really finding a solution that we as trustees were happy with, that would work for the employer as well. So it's finding that sort of middle ground. And in terms of a good example, the advisor in that case was able to identify that really my role was that person of trying to bring everybody together. And so before they presented their advice, they spoke to me about how to do that and what key messages that they should focus on. knowing that I would have good insight in terms of what the rest of the trustee board would be thinking, and also the fact that I would understand, what the employer's main concerns were. So they were able to then tailor their sort of presentation and their advice to sort of meet those two particular requirements, such that we were able to, certainly from my perspective, relatively quickly get to a position where the trustees were comfortable with what was being proposed, and I knew that the employer would be comfortable with what was being proposed as well. And so we avoided the possibility of the advisor effectively potentially presenting the same result, but in a different way, which would have pushed the trustees into a different direction. And so that sort of approach, I think, works very well. It's a good example of the advisor thinking ahead in terms of the potential issues that might arise.
I guess it's a very quick bolt-on example. I was in the middle of a pretty difficult mediation with multiple meetings trying to get to a solution. It wasn't a piece of delivered written advice, but an advisor sort of stopped everyone as we were talking about the things we disagreed with, and actually recanted back all the things we actually agreed with, and said, well, we've agreed this, we've agreed this, we've agreed this, we've agreed this. This is the only bit now that we're not agreeing on, and really just refocus people's minds on how much we've achieved rather than the bit we weren't happy about. And it really opened the room up to realize how close we were, and we did manage to break through a fairly complex mediation on an employer restructure. So just a really, really good sort of meeting tip to take that recap piece that actually ended up driving a result.
Okay, next question. How much consideration do you give quality of service offering ahead of fees, if any, when you're comparing your advisors?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and one we will obviously hear a lot. I think anyone involved in the tender process probably thinks we just picked the cheapest one. Ultimately, if you're spending money here, you're spending the scheme's money, and you're looking for a result, you need to select the advisor who's going to achieve that right result. And when we're constructing a shortlist, we would always look for comparable firms. There's no point picking two from the top tier and one from the boutique tier where there's tens of thousands of pounds of price differentials between them, because you'll never then justify to the employer why you want to spend all that money. We would always bring comparable firms against one another, and we would find that the differentials in fees would be relatively small in most of the processes we run for that reason. We understand the problem, we understand the best part of the market to deal with that problem, and we go to that part of the market to avoid the issue where fees do become so different that problem comes up. So service quality is number one, and service quality is the same, and one's £1,000 cheaper. We'll take the £1,000 less, but service quality is number one.
Yeah, and I would just echo that, Chris, as well. So, again, from a trustee perspective, what we're really interested in is service, quality of service, advice, support, making sure our members get what they need. And if sometimes that costs a bit more than we would ideally like to spend, then sometimes that's where we have to go, and that becomes part of our job in terms of getting the employer and everybody else to understand the position, so that they accept what we're saying as well.
Okay. I've got another question here. Are there aspects from the various output or deliverables you are getting from your advisors which you would like to change?
I think on that one, this goes back to some of the points we were just talking about a few minutes ago, actually. I guess the obvious thing I would say is that when we attend meetings and we get the pack through for the trustee meeting and we see the advice that's being provided, is that quite often, as Chris said earlier, you might find 10 or 20 pages of background, of information about the issue and so on, before you actually get to potential answers and solutions for what it is that you're actually having to tackle. That's a little bit of a gripe, in that it's a style and an approach that a lot of firms use. But it means that from our perspective, certainly as professional trustees, we've got to get through all of the first sort of 20 pages before we can actually get into the meat of the discussion that we want to actually have as a trustee board in terms of finding a solution. On the flip side, except that sometimes that gets presented because there are other trustees in the group that perhaps don't have that background information and therefore need it. I guess the piece from our perspective is to recognise that and have the ongoing patience to make sure that everybody in our board has got the knowledge and understanding they need to make the right decision.
I would basically echo what Vassos just said. I think when you're preparing for a presentation on anything really, you should run through your presentation. If you feel like you've just glossed over a slide, the slide shouldn't be there. People use, people have very, very long presentation decks are usually under prepared, and it's a comfort blanket, and that's not really a good message for the trustee board. If a slide's in a pack and you don't talk about it, take it out of the pack, because regardless of the board that's there, if those in front of you weren't planning to say it, have it out, save a tree.
Next question, what's the one thing that advisors do that most irritates you? It's like an agony aunt.
Okay, well, if I take that one first, I guess what you tend to see sometimes is this bit about scope creep, where you sometimes see, as you know, an agreed scope, and then issues come up and other things get thrown in on top, and what started off as a relatively focused piece of work suddenly becomes quite different and a lot more expensive. And I sometimes I will accept that that's a little bit unavoidable, but I think it happens too much. I also sense sometimes that we get presented as trustees ideas or presentations on new issues and new solutions and so on, which sometimes don't feel like they're that relevant to the actual scheme that we're talking about. And you sometimes feel as if the advisor, and I'm probably reading a little bit too much between the lines here, but you sometimes feel as if the advisor is going through a process of presenting the new ideas that firm has had over the last month or last quarter or something, partly to just in case the trustees happen to be interested and want to bite on something, but also because you get the feeling they're being put under a little bit of pressure internally to make sure all of their clients have heard about whatever it is that's new for that particular firm of advisors. And I guess from my own perspective, having previously come out of that environment myself, and then sitting on the other side of the table and seeing other advisors sort of having to go through that process as well, I sometimes have a little bit of sympathy, but also a little bit of frustration in terms of when I see that happen.
I would say my biggest irritation is sitting on the fence. If I wanted to know what the middle ground was, I wouldn't have asked for the advice. When we ask for advice, we want a recommendation and a solution. So I think fences are for surrounding gardens, not for advice documents. So I would prefer if people stayed off it if they could.
Okay. Final pre-submitted question, and then we have at least one more that's been given while we've been on air. Some decisions have to be made facing material uncertainty, for example, the COVID-19 recovery. How can advisors best support these?
I'll maybe take that one. So I think during COVID, the key thing was to know the audience. We had employers who were in a really, really challenged position. So we were looking for punchy advice that was turned around quickly, that was delivered pragmatically, and that didn't have a massive price tag. I appreciate that's not always easy, but the COVID was a very fast moving world. You needed an investment. Things were swinging around so quickly. If you wanted to move, you had to move quickly, or potentially not at all because it was too dangerous to do so. The business positions were in flux. So the speed of delivery, the efficiency and everything else was very, very, very important through COVID, and really understanding that audience. I got quite a few contractual RPI increases through in April, May, when I had employers who had 8,000 people on furlough. I think that probably comes from a standard sort of team, but knowing the audience and understanding when that probably wasn't a great time to send that letter, and you could have actually bought a huge amount of credit towards being that trusted advisor if you'd sat on that letter, or you said no, saying, listen guys, our contractual increase is due, we totally get where you're here now, let's just leave it a year, because RPI was far lower than it was in September and everything else. So there was some great opportunities through COVID, I think, to really get to that trusted advisor mantle that we all aspire in the advisory community to get to. So that would be my high level thoughts.
And from my perspective, Chris, to add to that, I guess when there is lots of uncertainty around in terms of what the future might look like, from a trustee perspective, it's understanding that and looking at a range of possible outcomes, and then trying to assess from our own perspective what we think is the most likely outcome based on that range of possible outcomes. And so from our advisor's perspective, presenting that, explaining that when there's so much uncertainty around is the most helpful thing. I mean, the other thing I would say out of COVID that came out was, and picking up on that point about uncertainty, was how the advice was presented and how clear it was and how focused it was as well. And again, that's a sort of a trait that I would particularly appreciate in the advisors that I work with, is that sort of piece around clear communication and so on. And often in that sort of scenario, there's a lot happening quickly, and that does incur usually, extra costs and fees and so on. And given the circumstances that a lot of the employers found themselves in with their own cash flow situations, having sort of a very open dialogue with us as trustee about costs and fees around some of that extra work, again, very helpful, because it allows us to position the whole situation with the employer so there are no surprises for them. That sort of whole principle of no surprises really was important during the whole COVID-19 crisis. There were so many surprises happening elsewhere that we as trustees and with our advisors, the last thing we wanted to do was introduce another load of surprises on top for the employer. So we needed to have that open dialogue, clear communication process as well.
Okay. There's one more question that's been submitted while we've been online. So it's from Edward Brown. When looking at tenders, do you consider whether a firm with lower headline rates might actually be more likely to over-lawyer or make a meal of something, and in fact prove more expensive than a firm with higher headline rates?
Not sure, Edward, but thank you for putting his name beside that one. But very, very good question. I think I think it's always important to unpack what you get in terms of tender deliveries, because usually everyone prices the original job fairly low because they want to win it. And considering the hourly rates and what happens beyond that and what the scope looks like is really important. I think the key for trustees is to scope a job fully so that you're actually, rather than just say, right, what is the cost of this piece of advice? Say, right, what is the cost for stage 1 of the advice? And if this happens, what would be stages 2, 3, and 4 in what's likely to be an iterative and predictable process in the majority of times? Because that allows you to see beyond the first piece of advice and actually understand whether those higher charge out rates will start to bite you as time goes on. And I think it's important across all of the disciplines that people have the ability to learn. And I don't want to say this person at this level can't work on my account, but it's about finding the right balance between the knowledge and experience of the partner, the director, the person at senior level, with the development of the good talent that's coming through the book. So we would always expect a blend anyway, but we are acutely aware of of watching the higher headline rates and the lower fees, because again, it quite often doesn't compute, and asking some challenging follow-up questions can really bring out any sort of any games at play in these presentations. And clearly, if we think they've been gaming the system in a tender, they're not going to win the work because they've lost the first test, which is trust. So we do keep a close eye on that when we're looking at work.
As a final question here, I'm conscious of time. Maybe Vassos, you could take this one. Do you expect to continue with video meetings even when things get back to something like the old normal?
So the short answer from me on that one is yes. I suspect that eventually when we get back to the old normal, there will be, I'm sure there will be some face-to-face meetings, but I also expect there to be a lot more video meetings than there were before COVID-19, because we've got a lot more used to doing them. They're working well. And I would suggest that trustees meeting with advisors is something we can do a lot more easily over video going forward than necessarily having to organise face-to-face meetings and all the travel and everything else that's involved. So I think the short answer to that one, Susan, is yes.
Okay.
Without wanting to challenge the voice in the sky, Susan, there was a couple of questions from the original pre-list that I noted, and just to confirm for those that submitted them, there was a question on
Oh,
trustee board, and I think Vassos covered that in his earlier answer, so we didn't repeat that. And there was also a question about what are the characteristics of a good advisor, and I think we've covered that throughout all the answers we've given. But to me, it's just stakeholder management. Keep people aware, keep them informed. If you're going to miss a deadline and you know you're going to miss it, tell them as soon as you find out, because it's not about hitting every deadline. It's about managing expectations and being a good consultant, advisor, lawyer, and that's my general feel on that. I'll pass to Vassos for any final comments and wrapping up.
Thanks, Chris. Well, no extra points from me other than say thank you for everybody who's been on the call, and hopefully everybody found that helpful. We will be doing more teas with a trustee going forward, so watch out for the invites, and hope to be speaking to you all again soon. Thank you.
Thanks all.